Okay, everyone, and hello, and this is Shepard. Today, talking about switch axes. We're going to go over a couple things today, kind of help clarify a lot of the different ways that you could run the switch axe, what sort of Rampage Decos you may or may not want to run, as well as the switch skills you'll like, and then general armor skills to go for. This should be a longer one. I'm going to put some timestamps somewhere, so click around or ahead if you feel like you already understand one part, and just go ahead and get to the section that interests you. So when you're taking a look at switch axes, you're going to notice that, for the most part, the vast majority of switch axes that are available to us are either power file or elemental file. It's not incredibly obvious exactly what these files do. I mean, obviously, power file lends itself to the idea that you're going to be getting stronger in some way. Elemental file will indicate that you're going to be getting more element. Put specifically, those files apply to any sort of your file bursts, as well as attacks that are done while you're in sword mode. So power file makes it so that our normal sword attacks get an additional 15% raw, as well as any sort of file damage we do. So when we're in an amp state, we'll get 15% more raw as well. Power file specifically, one of the hardest weapons to amp up. Amp up is the little outline around our amp gauge in the top left, right next to our sharpness. You can see this one just takes a lot of work. You know, you can do the Heaven Sword combo. You know, you could even do like a little elemental discharge to get out quickly. And we'll get into the combos a little bit more. But once you're there, you can actually go ahead and see this. Again, it only works while you're in sword mode. Notable exception being when we have the Phial Rampage Deco slotted in, which we're going to talk about relatively soon. Elemental file works much in the same way as power file. Big difference being, instead of 15% more raw, you get 45% more element. Again, this applies while you are in sword mode, and to any of the amped proc files that you will get. Main difference being our ability to amp up is much, much easier with an elemental file than it is in a power file, making this way easier to use. So the main thing when you're deciding between whether you want power file or elemental file is just take a look at whatever the ratio would be between the raw damage they take from cutting as well as the elemental damage they take. If the thing takes at least 25% elemental file and you just want to have the ease of use of elemental file and how easy it is to amp up, it's probably a pretty good idea to bring that along. Otherwise, for things that really do not take much elemental damage at all, at least consistently, something like, say, a Magnum Malo, may want to consider bringing power file along. Of course, there's another couple of different file types that we're going to be talking about again soon, and those are all, of course, perfectly applicable as well, depending on what you're fighting, but that's just kind of the general idea when you're choosing between the weapons. And in terms of like which ones to choose out of the tree, it's generally pretty obvious. You've got, you know, usually your very high elemental file, and then you've got your somewhat less element, but still relatively high element power file choices as well. Paralysis and poison file appear to work the same way. When you're in sword mode or with your amped attacks, you have a 1/3 chance to apply that status. In this case, we would deal 24 paralysis every time it went off. Not particularly amazing, but something to keep in mind. At least 4 paralysis could be a okay way in like multiplayer to try and get that off. As for poison, just because of the way poison works, you'd almost definitely want to go for a high poison weapon that has elemental file. Elemental file will multiply that poison damage by 45%, likewise with blast. Dragon file is maybe the most sad. Dragon file just adds whatever dragon file amount to sword attacks. It's pretty bad. The only small advantage this weapon has is it's the easiest to amp weapon, I believe, among the switch axes, but you lose so much by the fact that all you're really doing is adding a very small amount of dragon damage to your attacks that it's just really not worthwhile. Exhaust file is particularly interesting. Exhaust in general just functions different than almost anything else. When you're attacking an enemy with Exhaust Phial, you're building up a hidden status effect on them that will cause them to flinch from the exhaustion damage you do. In addition, the little exhaust procs that you do add a small amount of KO per hit, so you can eventually get some exhaustion or some KOs off in that way. Of particular note, exhaustion does have unique effects against afflicted monsters. For afflicted monsters, to get them out of their afflicted state, you need to deal a certain amount of raw damage or a certain amount of exhaustion damage, and I believe the two work together. So if you're fighting a monster that is afflicted and you don't have a good elemental option and you don't necessarily want to use Power Phial because you don't want to use that, Exhaust Phial ends up being a particularly decent choice. Reconquerus here is, of course, the most balanced and flexible option of the Exhaust Phials, but I believe Diablos and Tigrex are probably fine options as well, if you'd rather use those. Okay, so that about covers it for the different Phial types. We're going to go a little bit into the motion values of some of the abilities and just talk a little bit about those. So, fundamental to Switch Axe is getting yourself into the amp state. So again, getting your little amped gauge over in the top left corner fully heated up so that you can get your Phial bursts to go out. And of note about these Phial bursts, there's only 3 things that affect them. Well, I guess technically 4. It is your raw damage, so whatever your raw damage is, plus whatever your element is, plus the sharpness, plus any Phial type modifier. So in, Power Phial's case, 15% more raw, Element's case, 45% more element. Outside of that, every Phial burst in the game now does 10% motion value. This is different from Monster Hunter World, which had a very strange balancing for the motion values. I think Elemental Phial had like 5% motion value on those bursts, compared to Power Phial and some other Phials that had 10%, which made Elemental Phial basically unusable in Monster Hunter World. But now all the Phials are relatively well balanced. I would say Dragon Phial is closer to Power Phial now than Elemental Phial was in Monster Hunter World. And so when we're playing the weapon, you really want to play it in a way that's going to be keeping you in that amp state fairly consistently. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the switch skills and the general loadouts that I use, but reasons why you may want to switch depending on the sort of play style that you do. The original switch skill here is forward slash. Forward slash doesn't really do too much. It's just a very quick poke that allows us to get in and out of other moves very quickly. It's not like the damage is very good, but it's a very low non-committal attack. Forward overhead slash, on the other hand, does hit very hard, and it has the benefit of going into a strong, different transformation combo. If you're fighting something that you know is just going to be stuck on the ground a lot, not going to be fighting back, I could see how you may want to use this ability, but for the most part, I find that the overall commitment to it doesn't make a whole lot of sense compared to just having the general mobility of our forward slash here. Next up is Finishing Discharge versus Compressed Finishing Discharge. Finishing Discharge kind of works in 2 different ways. On one hand, it gives us the ability to do that elemental discharge like that. And once you're in an amp state, it allows you to latch onto a monster. So you'll continue to stay on. You still take full damage if you're up in this, and you will get blown back unless you use a Wirebug skill we will talk about relatively soon. But it does a lot of damage. Compressed Finishing Discharge, on the other hand, has no difference depending on whether you're in an amp state or not. Of note, you want to note that this does blast people around you away from you, so try not to use this in multiplayer. It does provide a relatively large buff to your amp state. However, it doesn't feel like it's necessarily as versatile as using the normal elemental discharge, so I generally do not use it. Next up is the Axe Wide Sweep versus the 2-staged Morph Slash combo. This is one of the more interesting changes that's been given to us with the Sunbreak DLC. The normal Axe Chop combo It does end up actually being pretty good damage. I mean, it's a powerful move. You're no longer necessarily committed into going into sword mode either. So I'm not going to say necessarily this is a bad move. But in terms of versatility, the two-stage morph combo does a couple things that are really great for us. On the one hand, it refills our gauge by quite a bit. On the other hand, it also gives us a lot of amp state. And then it has an additional, yet third benefit to it as well that I gotta get below in terms of my gauge over here to show off. So normally when we're below that little white line with our gauge, we can't go into sword mode without reloading first. But with two-stage morph combo, it will actually regain the gauge, allowing us to do a sword attack, and then generally getting us above that white spot again so that we can actually go into sword mode and then start doing our normal transformation combos again. I think in a very advanced play style, I could see somebody switching back and forth between the two and then potentially using the axe wide swing. But for the most part, especially with the way that our transformation combos work, if you have something like the Phial Boost Deco, which we're going to talk about soon, I'm just going to go ahead and use the normal circle to morph double slash. Next up, we have 3 different moves. I'm just going to show them each one at a time. Invincible Gambit's pretty straightforward. It gives you a long axe combo that allows you to have hyper armor as you go through moves. You're able to go into a sword or a axe attack out of this. One thing to note is if you're below the white meter, the white marker on your gauge, you will end up actually reloading, and it's very annoying. That attack is very easy to buffer in that way. I used to love Invincible Gambit, and I still kind of like it, but it's it's not as necessary as it used to be with the new switch skills that we have available to us. So after an elemental discharge, and especially with the ability to have 2 different switch skills available to us all the time, it's always nice to have Soaring Wyvern Blade. Soaring Wyvern Blade allows us to cancel out of the zero-sum discharge finisher. Once you finish that attack, it's almost always a good idea to tap whatever your transform button is to go back into axe mode as well, by the way. It will shorten that cooldown, get you a little bit of gauge back as well. For the most part, I don't run Invincible Gambit at all anymore. Wire Step is an ability that I could see if you were not confident about being able to counter things with the skill we're going to talk about soon. Wire Step is not an ability I use that often. It's a little bit awkward to aim in terms of what direction you're going to go. I can definitely see somebody wanting to use it very last minute if a monster's targeting you, but especially with the tracking that monsters have and the sort of cooldown that you're going to have in it anyways, I'd still rather recommend having one of the counter moves as your main defensive option than using that anyways. All right, last 2 things are the Elemental Burst Counter as well as the Switch Charger. Switch Charger, very straightforward. It will refill your amp gauge as well as give you infinite amp gauge for a short period of time. Elemental Burst Counter takes some time to get active. There is quite a bit of cooldown, so if I mash the button to get into it, that's the fastest I could possibly get into it. So this is a very predictive counter that you're going to use, but you can stay in the state for as long as you have gauge to work on. Consequently, the ability also does work on, say, sleeping monsters as well. So say you're not in an amp state, and especially if you've got Power Phial, you can consider waking up a monster with the Elemental Burst Counter. It's really, really good damage. It does use a lot of wire bugs, but in general, you're not going to have a stronger wake up. That being said, if you just don't have the bombs or you don't want to go through the effort, the overhead chop into the morph double slash into a triple slash into a transform combo is still going to be pretty good. Okay, I'm going to go a little bit into sort of the general combat and move set with the Switch X. If something has moved very far away from you, Wire Bug into an Axe Chop into Transform is, again, always a nice ability. If you are low on gauge as well as low on amps, it's always a good idea to consider going to the 2-stage morph combo. It achieves a lot. It will amp you up and it will give you more gauge. When you're actually fighting the monster, depending on whether it's a small opening, a large opening, and how much health you have, you'll generally do a double slash into a transform, into another slash, into another double slash and transform. And this is generally like your downed combo that you'll generally use. It's going to be your highest damage, and especially if you've got the Phial Deco, which we're going to talk about again, I promise, very soon when we talk about what Rampage decos you may want to run. This one works out fairly well. Of course, if the monster's about to get up, you could always do a double slash into an elemental discharge. Especially if you're fighting an afflicted and they get you with blood blight, that almost always works out okay. In the end, if we found ourselves with this specific situation here, no problem to go ahead and do the 2-stage morph combo just like that. I already showed the combo before, but I'll show it again. Again, if the monster's sleeping or down or whatever, or attacking us, we could always use his elemental burst counter to go ahead and get ourselves into the amp state and deal additional damage in that way. And then if we're really low, say we're in amp state, I always like to switch over to blue occasionally to get the switch charger and then just go right back and then take full advantage of the fact that we have infinite gauge for just a little bit longer. If you're running Power Phial, and especially if you don't want to use the elemental burst counter, either you're afraid of the monster or you don't want to try and do the bomb trick, another thing to consider is getting your power axe mode up. You simply do wild swings, which, by the way, do get slightly stronger the longer you do it for. I don't know that that's ever really worth doing for that damage, but certainly getting the heavy slam into power axe mode is nice. It fills up your amped gauge quite a bit faster. It's very noticeable on sword mode. And I think it does add a small part break modifier, but I have not been able to test that. One thing to note, in the older playstyle of Rise, people would use the Soaring Wyvern Blade to help amp up their power files. It doesn't feel nearly as effective as it used to, and especially if we're talking about, the elemental burst counters, it doesn't really feel that worthwhile. But it is worth noting that that is a wire bug skill that you could use to get the very last bit if for some reason the positioning made sense. Okay, so the most interesting Rampage decoration that you'll consider using is the Switcher Duel. It says it grants special effects to files when executing morph attacks. And what this really does is, you remember when we were talking about how with Power Phial, you get 15% more raw in sword mode, and Elemental Phial, you get 45% more element while in sword mode. What this does is it makes it so that when we're doing our transformation attacks, say double slash to morph double slash, these axe attacks are going to get the benefit of having that additional raw or that additional element. It's pretty amazing. It's really a huge game changer with Power Phial. Being able to make those attacks stronger is a big deal. Likewise, it does increase the effects of the 2-stage morph combo. It will allow you to get more gauge back as well as more amp. This is more beneficial, of course, for Power Phial than it is for Elemental Phial, but it still is good on Elemental Phial as well, simply because it makes those gauges that much more easier to manage, as well as giving you the additional elemental damage on those axe attacks as well. So when we're taking a look at what sort of Rampage file to run, the general idea would be either, your specific anti-species for 5% overall damage on everything. If you're to play a very heavy sword playstyle and you were very good at managing your file, I could see this being fine for Power Phial. If you wanted to have way easier time managing your Power Phial, as well as generally stronger morph attacks, and that you liked running Rapid Morph and used those combos a lot, I would say Switcher is a pretty big deal on your Power Phial. If you're running Elemental Phial, oddly enough, I would generally not recommend running Elemental Bane. Elemental Bane on parts that take 25% or more elemental damage gives you 20% more element. But it just doesn't feel super consistent. If you were fighting maybe a Hermitar or Shogun Sienitar, something that took 35% element, and you were convinced that you're going to be doing nonstop zero-sum discharges into Soaring Wyverns on their face, maybe. But even then, you're probably going to end up running out of Phial and having to do all sorts of switch charges and stuff to keep that up, and it just doesn't feel worthwhile. So in that case, I would, again, generally recommend either the Anti-Species or the Switcher Deco. In terms of armor skills, you kind of want to follow a general guideline that I gave before in terms of what actually affects the damage that you deal. Your Phials are determined primarily based off of your attack, your sharpness, added element, and then your Phial type. So in terms of running crit really doesn't do anything to your Phials at all. So you can see here I'm running full crit anyways, and I'm up to 6 points of attack. But an argument could be made that I should drop that last 1 or 2 points of crit eye and put 1 more point of attack boost to get more damage. The only main downside of that, though, is, of course, while our Phials are a considerable amount of damage, we're still hitting with lots of other parts of our weapon. And especially when we are not in an amp state, that's going to be time when our crit is going to be keeping up on damage much more considerably. Ultimately, I'm going to feel like this is going to come down a lot more to what sort of charm you're running, as well as what enemy type you're fighting. Certainly, if you're going to be fighting something like Arachnokodachi or something that's going to be having a lot of bad hit zones put in front of you, you'll want to go more onto the attack side. If the weakness exploit is not hitting nearly 100% of the time, it's just not worth it. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the different choices of elemental and other switch axes that are available to us and which choices you may go for. Fire's pretty easy. Rathalos gives us a 330 raw, native purple sharpness, relatively decent fire at 47 with a level 3 Rampage slot, as well as a Magmadron 320 raw, solid white, huge fire at 78, and then also a level 3 Rampage slot. Of course, it's going to really depend on the monster that you're fighting in terms of whether you'd want to go element or power. I'd say, in general, it comes down to how confident you are at landing those elemental burst counters in terms of being able to maintain your power Phial. Some things like, say, Goss Harag has some very strange elemental hit zones. He's got some that go very, very high, like his ice arms, but then drop off precipitously when his arms are not ice. So in cases like that, I would generally prefer to go Rathalos. But then you've guys like Royal Ludroth that takes 50 to 65 on the head in terms of raw, but 30% from fire, where Magmadron will likely end up dealing higher damage. We find ourselves in a similar situation again with water as we were in fire. Hermitar giving a very flexible option for power Phial on water, and actually close enough to just being one of the best power Phial weapons in the game anyways. Having those 2 level 2 slots is pretty convenient on anything that takes even a little bit of water. I wouldn't say we're quite at the point yet armor skill-wise where we're really able to get ourselves up to purple sharpness, unless you've got yourself an absolute god of god charms, but certainly in Title Update 1, getting this up to purple was going to be incredibly powerful. Almudron, of course, remains an extremely powerful water weapon. A big issue being is there's just really not enough things that take a ton of water damage, so if you had to prioritize one first, the Daimyo Hermitor Switch Axe probably ends up being the more flexible choice for you to use overall on things that are weak to water, assuming, of course, you're comfortable, again, using the power Phial. Ice has a very strong option in terms of the Kushala Deora. Again, native purple, 320 raw, very high ice, and a level 3 Rampage slot. It makes this a very easy choice for power Phial in terms of Switch Axe. Looks pretty cool, too. I like the bat. Reminds me a little bit of Morbius. The elemental Phial, on the other hand, doesn't leave as much to be exciting for some reason. I don't know why I'm less excited about the Legambi Switch Axe as I was about, say, the other options, say, Almudron. I guess it's because the ice is just really not that high. You're looking at 54 ice. If this was, say, 64 or 70, it'd be way better. But as it is, the ice is just not really there. It's technically got less ice than even our power Phial. So that means this Kushala Deora Switch Axe has already got a little bit of a head start before you start factoring in the different Phial abilities. So probably just Kushala Deora, unless, of course, you do not like running power Phial, in which case Legambi is fine. Thunder overall probably gives us the most difficult decision-making between the different Phials to go for. Kezu gives us an elemental Phial with a level 3 Rampage slot, which, as we've talked about before, is kind of an interesting choice, although definitely not necessary on elemental Phial as much as it is on power. At 330 raw, that's really not that bad. Otherwise, what most people will likely end up just going for is the Narwa. Narwa is pretty bad on slots, but does give you access to purple sharpness relatively easily. You'll be limited in terms of your Rampage Phial. You will not be able to use the Phial boost one. But I think in general, for things super weak to Thunder, taking a look at things like the Hermitars and Shogun Sienitars and stuff like that, this will likely end up being the best option. Zinogre looks attractive at first. It has 330 raw, 45 Thunder, which isn't awful for power Phial, but it only has a level 2 Rampage slot, really limiting you in terms of the way that you're going to play it. Again, if you were going to go for a very heavy zero-sum discharge sort of play style, this one might end up being better. But I think for the most part, for just general use and flexibility, the Thunder Tree is really nice. 350 raw is absolutely massive, and especially given that it is at 0% affinity, means it's like one of the highest raw weapons without an affinity drawback in the game. That level 3 slot helps out quite a bit. The fact that you don't need to worry about, getting up to purple sharpness also helps it out quite a bit. And a level 3 Rampage slot is, again, also really good. So on things that don't happen to take a ton of thunder damage, but, do take a lot of raw and you want to have the flexibility of power Phial, I'd say this is pretty good. I would say between this and the Hermitar Switch Axe are both good options depending on what type of Magnum Malo you're going to be fighting. The normal Afflicted Magnum Malo, you would probably want to go for the Thunder Tree. For the other rare species, I think you'd probably want to go for Daimyo Hermitar. In either case, depending on how you're building it and what sort of charm you have, you may find one is slightly better than the other. Last up is Dragon, and again, it's closer than you would generally think. For the most part, Valstrax weapons eat the lunch of pretty much any other Dragon weapon. They always have a ton of white sharpness. They always have, for the most part, have very good raw power, and their element is pretty good. And in this case, looking at it, it's got a level 3 slot and a level 2 Rampage slot. You're not going to be able to use the Phial Rampage Deco, but at the same time, Elemental Phial doesn't really need it. However, when you take a look at the Death Stench, it's a little bit closer. 330 raw is, pretty close to 340. It's not going to be super significant in terms of the amount of damage you do. It does have more element. So Valstrax at 51, Death Stench is at 60. It has 2 level 2 slots rather than 1 level 3, and it has a level 3 Rampage slot, meaning that if you like to do a absolute ton of transformation combos, as well as want to have the benefits of the 2-stage morph combo, I could definitely see Death Stench coming, pretty close, if not actually coming out slightly ahead, depending on your charm compared to Valstrax. Again, I'd say it's too far away in terms of a handicraft investment to get up purple as it is right now. You'll definitely need to run some sort of a sharpness skill on it. It can get away with Master's Touch if you really hate using Protective Polish, but in general, Protective Polish is the way you want to go in terms of using your Switch Axes. Okay, we talked a little bit about the exhaust Phials and Switch Axes before. We have the Reconquerus Or 2 line, has pretty easy access to purple sharpness, and 36 Phial on the exhaust, as well as a level 3 Rampage slot and 3 level 1s. Otherwise, I'd say the only other reasonable choice is Tigrex Switch Axe. It does get 10 more raw. It does start at native purple sharpness. However, it doesn't have any normal slots at all, only has a level 2 Rampage slot and has minus 20% affinity. Again, this is the sort of thing where I could see, if you're doing a lot of zero sums, maybe it could come out slightly ahead. But in general, for overall flexibility, I just prefer having the Reconquerus. Just getting one handicraft isn't that big of a deal. Having access to the rapid morph, the Phial change Rampage slot is also pretty nice. Defense bonus doesn't hurt either. And the 3 level 1 slots means that we'll easily be able to fit in the additional exhaust damage in there, as well as speed sharpener and stun resistance and things like that. So again, I talked a little bit before about the sort of general things that I run. Like I said, normally you don't want to give up too much crit for attack. But I would say in general, as long as you're hitting 4 points of attack boost, I think that's generally good enough. You know, unless you're fighting something that just takes a massive amount. Well, it wouldn't even make sense. They would need to take a lot of raw damage, but then not be able to be crit against. And that's just like counterintuitive. So being able to crit with your normal hits, assuming you're not constantly spamming zero-sum discharge, I would say is fine. If you are a zero-sumlet, though, then you're using that attack nearly every combo. Maybe give up that last point of crit eye, or maybe that last point of maximum might, and get yourself up to attack 7. All right, this video has gone on for way too long already. Hopefully you learned a thing or two. Let me know down in the comments below if there's a specific weapon you want to see next. I know a lot of people have been asking for Insect Glaive. I've got plenty to say on that weapon as well. If you haven't yet already, check me out, twitch.tv/SDShepherd. Subscribe, like the channel. I would appreciate it. Until next time, good luck, and have a good hunt.